So, welcome to my first APUS notes. Today I'll be discussing Chapter 1, Worlds Apart. So, Worlds Apart starts off by discussing pre-colonial civilization in America, Europe, and Africa. So, pre-contact America was split between regions like the Southwest, which had the Navajo and the Anasazi, the North with the Iroquois, the far North with the Eskimos and Inuits, the East with the Algonquins, the South with tribes like the Cherokee and the Creek, the West with the famous Comanches and Cheyenne, and California with the Modocs and the Klamath. And then down south in Latin America, there were stable expansionist empires like the Aztecs and the Inca that dominated much of Latin America at the time. Now, pre-contact Europe was drastically different than the Americas. They had just undergone their Renaissance, which was their rebirth of ancient Roman and Greek values, texts, and sciences. And they were also going through the Reformation, which was the split between the Catholic Church and into various Protestant sects. This is most apparent probably in England, where in the span of half a century they switched religions 3 times, from Catholic to Protestant, Protestant to Catholic, and Catholic again to Protestant. And because of the new inventions of the Renaissance and the new religious conflicts born by the Reformation, Europe was in a state of almost constant perpetual war. Now, pre-contact Africa had various similarities to the Americas. It was split into different areas with various different ethnic groups and tribes, and even had an area analogous to Latin America in the Muslim North, which was home to various kingdoms and states. Now, the chapter goes on to discuss the events of 1492. It focuses mostly on Spain, which had just completed its Reconquista, which was the liberation of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims that conquered it originally in the 9th century. Excuse me. They had also just conquered the Canary Islands, which would later serve kind of as a base for their expeditions into the Americas, and they were actively trying to reduce the Muslim middleman's role in the international trade and international economy. And then 1492 is especially famous for the year that Columbus made his famous voyage to the Americas. As you can see here, see, Europe, Columbus on the Pinta, Santa Maria, and Nina, and to the Americas. Now, the original goal of this voyage was to find trade routes into Asia, mostly into India, China, and Japan. Although this was initially unsuccessful, he did land in the Americas, and although the expeditions were a failure, they led to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Now, the conquest started out mostly in the Caribbean islands, where they wiped out many of the Native American groups there and began to replace them with African slaves as heavy labor on their mines and plantations, which brings up the issue of slavery in the New World. Now, slavery began, well, in this form, can you see it? As a West African tradition. They were originally criminals or prisoners of war. They were treated somewhat humanely and were occasionally awarded with freedom. But as you probably remember from Mr. Andrews' class, the European side of slavery was less humane. It was born mostly out of economic opportunity, the use of slaves as cheap free labor in mines and plantations. They were treated very inhumanely. They were bought from North African merchants. They were reduced to hard labor in mines and plantations, and they were forced into the Americas, but mostly into, at the time, into Spanish and Portuguese colonies in present-day Mexico, Brazil, and the Caribbean. Now, the Spanish conquest also led to the destruction of the Aztec and Inca empires, and led to the foundation of New Spain in their wake. And they also made frequent forays into what's now the present-day United States. The most famous is probably De Soto's expedition to the Mississippi River. They treated every Native American, well, almost every Native American group horribly. And on the flip side of this, the huge Spanish success in the Americas actually led to the stagnation of the Spanish economy because of the massive influx of silver and gold bullion and treasures into Spain. This led to huge inflations, which led to the decline of the Spanish economy, as you can see in this graphic. See? In 1492, they were kind of riding a high wave, or at least according to this, and it slowly decreased by 1600, which was due to massive inflation. Now, Columbus's discoveries and the Spanish conquest led to what is called the Columbian Exchange. It's similar to the triangle trade of the later British colonies, except it was between the Spanish and it was led by the Spanish and the Portuguese. So it's mostly that from Europe to the Americas, livestock was brought to the Americas, like sheep and horses. Germs, which led to massive diseases that destroyed the Native American populations, and the influx of settlers, which began to replace the Native American populations as the dominance of the area. Now, the Europeans brought back from the Americas to Europe livestock, gold, which was probably their main objective, and crops like the potato and corn, which later became staples in the European diet. The main excuse me, sorry, I'm hunting for the word. The main contribution, thank you, to the Columbian Exchange of Africa was slaves to Europe and the Americas, as I said earlier. They were taken mostly against their will, bought from merchants, and transported for heavy labor in plantations and mines. Now, the European view of Native Americans was generally negative and biased. They viewed Native Americans as non-religious heathens in need of conversion, and they saw them as extremely primitive. This, among other things, led to some differences in culture, was due to differences in culture, like women and men's roles in society. Traditionally, in Native American society, at least in what the present-day United States, men were valued as hunters and warriors, while women stayed back in the village and tended the farms. Versus European society, which was very male-dominant, and the men were explorers and such, the providers of the family, and women were domestic workers, basically, taking care of children, cooking, cleaning. This led to amusing exchanges between Native Americans and Europeans. The Europeans saw Native American men as lazy, and especially how they treated their women as farmers. And the men saw the use of women as domestic labor as a waste of a good resource. And then later on, the French began to attempt to colonize the Americas. They were initially preoccupied with their affairs in Europe, and began to conduct several failed expeditions into the Americas. One of which was led by an Italian explorer that the French crown hired. The entire crew nearly froze to death on the St. Lawrence, I believe it was the St. Lawrence River. They also attempted to colonize various areas of the Americas. One example was their attempt of colonization in North and South Carolina, which was an extreme failure, and the settlers had to resort to cannibalism before they were rescued by the French. The French government was later distracted by the 30 Years' War, which was sparked between religious differences between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the French drew out, at least for the meantime, of the race for America. Now the English, on the other hand, had just were at the time under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, and were fresh off a victory in their Irish campaigns. So the England was filled with experienced soldiers who wanted adventure, glory, and gold. So America was almost a dream come true for them. So among these Irish veterans that went to America was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. He convinced the Crown, after 5 years of lobbying, to allow him to create a colony on America and landed in Newfoundland. The colony was a failure, and on the return voyage to England, him and the settlers were lost at sea. But this at first didn't deter anyone, like his half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, who went on to found the infamous Roanoke colony, of Virginia. As the story goes, Sir Walter Raleigh establishes the colony, waits for Virginia Dare, his, I believe, granddaughter, and the first British child to be born on American soil, and then goes back to England for supplies. He's unable to return for 3 years, and when he comes back, he finds the colony in shambles, completely deserted, his charts, maps, and paintings slowly rotting, and the only clue he has was this: Croatoan. At first he thought it was a sign that they just went to nearby Croatoan Island, but due to bad weather, he was never able to make an expedition there, and the fate of the Roanoke colonists is unknown to this day. So this basically stagnated the English interest in the Americas until this guy, Richard Hallyot, wrote an essay called "The Discourse of Western Planting," which was describing how England had a surplus population and that it would be good for the government, the economy, and for the English in general to supplant some of this surplus population into the Americas. Now, to answer the big picture question, yes, I believe the largest factor motivating the European expansion to the New World was to counter the biggest incentive for European powers to expand to the New World was so they could counter and measure each other's expansion and influence across the world. And to answer the chapter question, Columbus's discovery should be celebrated for its positive effects, namely the foundation of the United States. But the negative effects shouldn't be swept under the rug. They should be remembered for what happened: the destruction of Native American civilization, the mass enslavement of Africans, and the extension of European conflicts into American soil. These should be remembered for the travesties and tragedies that they were. And then, this is American history. Good night.